My name is Amy MacKinnon and I'm here with Dr. Ian McAllister and Uma Patel, and we're discussing the politics of lowering the voting age to 16 in Australia.
So Ian, you recently released a paper that goes through this, and I was just wondering if you could just quickly take us through how you collected the data and how you chose what to collect.
Well, I was interested in the arguments for and against reducing the voting age to 16, and I suppose my initial stimulus for that was the decision to lower the voting age to 16 for the Scottish independence referendum. And we'd asked a similar question in our Australian election survey in 2010, so I really wanted to look at some of the arguments for and against lowering the age, and also public support for it, because I'd noticed in the United Kingdom and particularly in Scotland there was actually quite a lot of support for voting at age 16. So essentially what I did was I used opinion surveys that had been conducted here in Australia since 1967 to look at some of the patterns in terms of participation among younger people, the extent to which they had political knowledge, their political interest, and also to look at some of the equity arguments about lowering the voting age to 16. So it was very much driven by evidence. I had no firm view whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. I really just wanted to test the arguments.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What did you find, I guess, will be my next question. Like, did you come out for or against lowering the voting age?
I find there was very limited evidence for the arguments that are used to favour lowering the voting age to 16. Three basic arguments. One is equity, that the voting age needs to be lowered to 16 to bring it into line with various other things. Well, I find that, for example, marriage or consuming alcohol, driving a motor vehicle, things like that are all at 18. There's actually very few things that are at age 16. In fact, I think the only thing I find was getting a license to fly a balloon or a glider is age 16. Virtually everything else is age 18. The second argument is political participation, political engagement, and if people vote at an earlier age, then they're much more likely to do it later in their lives. That's particularly a potent argument in countries that have voluntary voting. We have compulsory voting, obviously, because turnout's been declining across a whole range of countries, the United States, Britain, France, Germany, and so on. And the argument is that if you can involve younger people at an earlier age, they're much more likely to vote later. And again, I find very little empirical evidence for that. And indeed, when the voting age was lowered from 21 to 18, it actually depressed turnout between 3 and 4 percentage points. And the third argument is to do with political maturity and political knowledge, that younger people are more politically mature and literate these days than they were in the past. And that was certainly an argument that was made in the United States in the late 1960s to justify lowering the voting age, which was eventually done in 1971. I looked at the surveys we'd conducted where we'd asked questions about political knowledge and political interest, and I found that younger people were actually less politically interested and less knowledgeable than older people. So really I didn't find any evidence to support the traditional arguments that are used to put forward lowering the voting age to 16.
Mm-hmm. Okay, the primary means for arguing that we shouldn't lower the voting age has kind of been based along age. And you've presented evidence very clearly that people who are in the over 60 age bracket vote at a much higher rate than people who are in the over 18 age bracket. Do you think, instead of having to do with more of a factor of age, do you think it's more about the appreciation of policy, appreciation of public policy, and how policy literacy factors into someone's choice to vote?
I think that's a reasonable argument. In our surveys, we ask questions about factual political knowledge.
Okay.
So, for example, we ask, is it true or false that Australia became a federation in 1901?
Okay.
And what we find is, when we ask a range of questions like that, the level of political knowledge is relatively low across the population, across the electorate, and it really hasn't changed all that much during the course of our surveys, which actually says a lot about the failure of civic education, but that's probably a separate argument. Because we're asking about factual knowledge, your question really taps into policy knowledge, and I think you do have quite a legitimate argument there to say that younger people have more policy awareness, and they're endeavouring to find out more about policies rather than basic factual political knowledge.
Okay. Do you think exposing young people to the political environment when they are in school at 16 or 17 might increase their level of factual knowledge about politics and therefore increase their levels of participation?
It appears to be not the case that
Okay.
it does work all that well, and there's probably good reasons for that. We know that people learn most about politics at home, and they learn most about it from their parents. They inherit party loyalties from their parents. About 60-70% of the electorate get into party politics and form their voting habits that way. School is a much more minor influence on how they develop a political awareness. So it's really what happens in the home, and if people aren't discussing politics at home, then it's probably not being reflected in their level of political interest.
I guess mine is more of a theory-based question. Do you think that we should base whether someone can vote or not on whether they are politically aware, or we should just base it on whether they are participants of society, like valid participants of society, I guess?
Well, I guess the logic of lowering the voting age to 16 would be that, well, why should you stop at 16? Why not 15, 14? And then you get into an argument about maybe testing people's levels of political literacy, the extent to which they have the knowledge to become a good citizen and to be able to vote in elections. And there's an argument made in some of the websites for lowering the voting age that why should you let a stupid older person vote and exclude a clever younger person? I think that's a perfectly valid argument as well. If you do follow the logic of that, then what you should do is probably test everybody in the electorate, and they should pass a test before they are allowed to vote. So in theory you could have a person aged 8 or 10 who might be allowed to vote if they had the requisite political knowledge, and you would exclude much older people if they didn't have the political knowledge. So you'd really be restricting it to people that had levels of literacy that would be able to make quite sophisticated political judgments about how to vote and about policies.
Mm-hmm. But do you think there's a problem in that it's not necessarily based on whether they're politically knowledgeable, but kind of what you were saying earlier, but rather instead it should be based on whether policies will affect them and whether they care that those policies will affect them, full stop. So turning it more from a political party base or even a history base of judging whether someone is politically active to more of a policy base, so whether someone's interested in issues such as global warming or climate change or even asylum seekers. And then judging whether using that as a basis simply because if those issues are what matters, and that then the people governing us should care about those issues, should be represented that way.
I think what you're focusing on is the role of political parties and how effective political parties are in representing people, and particularly in what we're talking about, younger people. Mm-hmm. What we find in a lot of our surveys is that political parties don't appear to be all that effective in representing people. They tend to be, voters tend to be quite cynical about them. They don't necessarily trust them. Australia has quite a high level of efficacy in the sense that we feel political parties will do what we need when it comes down to it, but we don't necessarily trust them. And I think there's a real failure of political parties, not just in Australia but internationally, to effectively represent people across the board in terms of a whole range of policies. Now, partly that comes about because younger people are simply not joining political parties. The average age of a member of a political party these days is well in the 60s. And there's relatively few of them as well. Younger people are not becoming engaged in it. Political parties are not reforming themselves organisationally either. So, for example, if we look at the sort of organisations like Get Up and so on, and other organisations that make extensive use of social media, the major political parties here or internationally are not doing a lot of that. Now, there are some exceptions. The Scandinavian political parties are actually quite good at it, and they're doing a lot of interesting things. But here in Australia, they're actually not, and I think that's part of the problem.
Okay, well, I think lowering the voting age to 16 would change the political landscape of Australia, particularly in terms of increasing the cohort of young people that a party has to engage with. By default, you're increasing the number of people that care about a certain issue. Do you think maybe forcing the political parties by expanding the voting age, forcing the political parties to engage with younger people could enrich the public policy debate and take it away from the sound bites that we see on interest rates mortgages to maybe issues that legitimately affect the future of the nation, such as climate change, foreign policy, and things like that.
I think part of the problem these days is that political parties are in a transitional stage, and they've not really adapted to new forms of communication, the internet, new social media, Web 2.0 and so on. Another 15, 20 years they probably will have, but at the moment we're in a transition between almost pre-modern form of political party and a fully modern web-based political party organisation. And we have various organisations which do appeal to younger people. I mentioned Get Up before, but there's a variety of other ones as well. And I would have thought in the longer term these organisations will mesh themselves into political parties. Another 15, 20 years we'll have something which might be called a political party, but will be more flexible, more activist, much more appealing, and will have a range of policies to engage younger people, which they're currently not doing.
Did you look at how much public support there would be for lowering the age to 16? I was just wondering on the actual number of...
Yes, we did. We asked a question in the 2010 Australian election survey on that, and we found that only 12% of people in the electorate were in favour of reducing the voting age to 16. We did interview election candidates as well, and we found that about 1 in 3 were in favour of reducing the voting age. When we drilled down into those figures, we found it was mostly Green candidates, and of course it's Green Party policy to reduce the voting age to 16. Now that actually contrasts with what we find, for example, in Britain, and there's been a variety of surveys done there which show that around about 32% of voters are in favour of lowering the voting age. So what we have in Australia is really not hardly any public support for lowering the voting age, but actually quite a lot of support in other jurisdictions.
And so in the electoral survey, were 16 and 17-year-olds counted within that group that were...
No, they weren't. We interviewed people who were in the voting electorate, who were 18 and over on the electoral register.
Do you think that's a bit of an issue, the people who are already allowed to vote being asked whether they want other people to vote? Like historically, whenever the base for votes has been broadened, the people that already have the vote have generally been negative, at least at first. So do you think that might be an issue that we, characterise public support by the people that aren't the ones that would be getting the vote, I guess?
Well, we did look at other surveys that have interviewed 16, 17-year-olds, and we found that there was certainly slightly more support for lowering the voting age among that group compared to, say, 18, 19, 20-year-olds, but it was really a matter of only a few percentage points. So by looking at 18 and over in our survey, I don't think we're radically misjudging what the mood of the electorate would be.
Okay, in your paper you describe how lowering the voting age from 21 to 18 really didn't affect levels of political participation. Do you think that by lowering the voting age from 21 to 18, we only really caught the people who would have voted anyway, who are already engaged in the public policy dialogue? 18 is usually the entrance fee, the entrance age for university, and for young, just over 30% of young people that go to university to be involved in a political policy debate. But I think the broader thing we're missing is the fact that in college we have over 80 to 90% of the population of that age group in one spot where they can engage with each other in a public policy debate. And when people leave school, 70% of them don't go to university. So if we catch them early in an environment where they're all together, we might actually serve to increase the amount of participation that's happening.
Yes, that's certainly one of the arguments that's made when people finish school and get into the workforce and so on. They've less time and less interest in voting and doing a variety of other things, and when they're still at school they might become more engaged. I would have thought that would largely depend on whether or not schools would be prepared to do a lot more civic education. And the evidence we have about the effectiveness in civic education in generating more political knowledge is fairly slight, and it doesn't appear to be the case that it actually does all that much in improving political literacy.
But these days, children not even children, 16 and 17-year-olds don't go home and play around with their neighbours. They log onto their computers and they engage with social media. They log onto chat rooms and speak with people all over the world. Do you think that dialogue should be dismissed, or do you think it might serve to change the way young Australians engage with policy and politics?
No, I certainly think that dialogue is very important, and there's quite a big academic literature which shows that people communicating with others on the internet and so on generates a sense of social capital which is very similar to a face-to-face type of social capital. So I think that actually is very important. The broader point behind a lot of this is that there's one view which is that younger people don't engage in politics and they know less about politics and less interested and so on. The other view is that is the case. People who are young are less interested in politics, but only certain types of politics. And they're less interested in voting, they're less interested in political parties, but they're much more interested in the sorts of activities you've talked about, engaging with social media groups, talking to people overseas and so on, about political issues, about climate change and so on. And I have to say the evidence is probably towards the latter argument, that in fact younger people are not less interested in politics per se, but less interested in old-fashioned types of traditional politics, and probably at least as interested as they have been in the past in these new types of politics.
Do you think this, by lowering the voting age, will be a good way of encouraging politicians to sort of engage with younger people, or engage on things that younger people find important, I guess, rather than the over 6-year-olds, as you say? Well,
politicians always chase votes, so if there's a lot of votes among 16 and 17-year-olds, I'm sure they would adapt their strategies to try and appeal to them. So potentially a lot of these things could happen. I guess in the paper I was writing, I was really looking at the evidence for or against the various arguments that are currently made about lowering the voting age, and I really didn't find any support for it. I mean, what you're saying is quite a reasonable argument, that if politicians saw an electoral advantage in gaining the votes of younger people, they would change their appeals and adapt it. That's certainly possible, but you'd, in the context of the Australian electorate, you would only be adding about 500,000 new voters out of a total electorate of 12 million. So it wouldn't be huge, and you would have to really put a very dramatic political appeal to make it worth your while, in terms of maybe alienating other groups of voters and so on. So whether politicians would do anything very dramatically different, I'm not entirely sure.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Dr. McAllister.
Well, thank you very much.
It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you.